The Collins Line was founded in 1847, but it took a few years before the first ships were deployed. If you're looking for a company history, this video's companion documentary will give you a rundown of the full history, but this video is going to profile each of the company's fleet, chronologically, based on their launch date. The Collins Line had 4 ships, and then an upscaled half-sister as a 5th fleet mate. The first 4, the Atlantic, Pacific, Arctic, and Baltic, were all nearly identical with minor variations. All designed by naval architect George Steers, they were 282 feet on deck, 45-foot beam, and made of white oak, chestnut, and yellow pine. The British ships of the time that dominated the seas were dark and cramped, and often compared to coffins. On the other hand, the Collins liners were bright, comfortable, and well ventilated. While on the outside they appeared to be bulky and industrial looking, their interiors were quite elegant. They had 2 grand saloons, one for dining and one for socializing, and passenger berths branching off of them. The windows were adorned with stained glass and carpets on the floor. Furniture of the finest carved woods and Italian marble tabletops adorned the interiors. It's also said that these 4 ships were the first vessels to have steam heating and barber shops. They were fast and almost always ran at top speed, which meant that they burned up to 85 tons of coal a day, more than double that of their competition. This would ultimately be one of the main downfalls of the Collins Line. The Atlantic. Oddly, the Atlantic, the first ship of the Collins fleet, is hardly talked about. I really had to scrounge for material on her part of this video. The Atlantic was the first of the 5 ships built for the Collins Line, the first 4 of which were all nearly identical. She was built in New York City by William H. Brown Shipyard, being launched on January 2nd, 1849. Her engines, built by the Novelty Iron Works, with 95-inch cylinders and a 9-foot stroke. When she was launched, she was the biggest ship in the world. Well, biggest ship except for Brunel's SS Great Britain, which was soon to be sailing the Australian routes, making the Atlantic the biggest vessel on the North Atlantic, at least. She departed on her maiden voyage on April 27, 1850, from New York to Liverpool. Running at her top speed, she beat Cunard's westbound record by 12 hours. Atlantic's career with the Collins Line was virtually uneventful, with 2 exceptions. On January 6, 1851, only 1 day short of arriving in New York, her engine shaft broke and disabled her engines. The wind was strongly against her, but she raised sails and attempted to reach Halifax. But when that didn't work, she tried to get to Bermuda, and finally had to turn around and follow the wind back to Cork, Ireland, arriving 2.5 weeks late. During that 2.5-week time, she was believed to have been lost with all hands. At the helm during this ordeal was Captain West, and to celebrate his skillful navigation back to shore safely, a charming little musical piece was written in his honor. The piece you are listening to right now in the background of this section, recreated from an original copy of the music from my collection, and recorded by a friend of mine, Maritime historian J. Kent Layton. After hearing its charm, it quickly became one of my favorite pieces of the time. In 1851, the beautiful Crystal Palace opened for the Great Exhibition in London. Industries of all nations gathered in the palace to show off the finest of their countries and open new possibilities for trading. One of the premier events of the long, several-month exhibition was in July, when several dignitaries took an excursion from the palace on the Great Western Railway for an evening party aboard the steamer Atlantic, having dinner in her grand saloon, after which the hosts toasted their friends. A toast was given to His Royal Highness Prince Albert and then to President Millard Fillmore. The toasting continued, toasting Atlantic's Captain West, as well as the organizers of the exhibition, and the shipping fleets of the world. The Atlantic had represented the United States well, with even the London Illustrated News speaking of the pride that they felt dining aboard the ship and under the American flag. The dinner and toasts were seen as one of the best examples of Great Britain and the United States bonding during that time. Jumping ahead a few years. When the Collins Line began to fold, the Atlantic sailed what would eventually be the company's second-to-last voyage, departing New York in December 1857. When the company did fold, the Atlantic sat laid up for over a year, before being bought alongside her younger sister, the Baltic, and put into service on the New York and Aspinwall route for about 9 months, before once again being laid up in 1860. The outbreak of the American Civil War gave purpose to the Atlantic once more. Edward Collins, her original operator, had petitioned the government for funding for these ships, claiming that they would be beneficial to the military should war break out. Now in 1861, he was to be proven correct. The Atlantic and the Baltic were sold to the North Atlantic Steamship Company and leased to the United States government as a transport for the entire duration of the war for $1,500 a day per ship, or about $50,000 in today's money, and dropping to $1,000 a day by the end of the war. After the war, the Atlantic and the Baltic were bought by the Ruger brothers and associates and brought into service for the North American Lloyd Line between the United States and Germany, stopping in Southampton in between. This didn't last long, only 6 voyages, and once more the Atlantic was laid up with her sister, then finally sold in 1871, brought up the Hudson River to Cold Spring, New York, and scrapped in the harbor. The Pacific. The Pacific was the second ship built for the Collins Line. Rather than being built by William H. Brown Shipyard like her sister, she was built by Brown and Bell of New York and launched on the 1st of February, 1849. Her engines, built by the Allaire Iron Works, were essentially the same as those installed on the Atlantic. She was fitted out over the following 15 months and sailed on her maiden voyage from the Collins Line Pier on the 25th of May, 1850 for Liverpool. During the course of her early career, she consistently broke speed records and captured the blue ribbon from Cunard for both east and westbound crossings, a record that would soon be taken away from her by her younger sisters. In 1851, second class was installed on board. On December 4th, 1852, in the middle of one of her crossings, the Pacific rescued the crew of the bark Jessie Stevens as she went down. Only 3 years later, in January 1856, the Pacific would meet her own fate when she went down with all hands. Nothing conclusive can be said about her disappearance, but a message in a bottle was found and signed by a confirmed passenger of the vessel, though it gave no significant further evidence. It's believed that she struck an iceberg and sank. For the full story on the Pacific's disappearance, you'll find a full documentary on my channel, including additional details about her rescuing of the crew of the bark Jessie Stevens. The Arctic. The Arctic was the third Collins liner and the largest of the original 4, making her the largest ship in the world, or largest aside from Brunel's SS Great Britain, currently undergoing a refit after getting beached and stuck for over a year. Arctic was built by William H. Brown, while her machinery was built by the Novelty Iron Works. Unlike her previous 2 sisters, a year had passed since the first 2 ships were completed, and engine technology improved. Arctic's engines were larger, with a 96-inch cylinder and a 10-foot stroke. The Arctic was launched on January 28, 1850, and sailed her maiden voyage in October of that year. Just over a year later, she won the blue ribbon from her older sister for an eastbound crossing, along with the title Clipper of the Sea for her speed. Unfortunately, the following years were a dramatic shift for the Arctic, and accidents ensued. She grounded in 1853 and struck a rock in early 1854. After being repaired, her engines were modified in an attempt to bring coal consumption down. Overall, it was successful, but the modifications were a strain on her wooden hull, and all money that was saved on coal ended up being spent shoring up the hull. Only 2 months later, Arctic sailed from Liverpool bound for New York and collided with a French ship, the Vesta, off of Newfoundland. The Arctic began to sink and made a mad dash for land, but didn't quite make it. She sank with a loss of over 300 souls, including the wife of Edward Collins and his son and daughter, and 6 family members of James Brown, who financially backed the Collins line alongside the government subsidies. For the full story of the Arctic's disaster, you'll also find a full documentary of this on my channel. The Baltic. The fourth and final of the original 4 Collins liners, all of nearly identical design, was launched from Brown and Bell Shipyard on February 5, 1850, 2 months or so before her oldest sister's maiden voyage. Her engines were built by the Allaire Works and had the same 96-inch cylinder and 10-foot stroke of the Arctic just before her. The Baltic was in service before the year was out, sailing her maiden voyage to Liverpool on November 16th. She sailed with the same high coal consumption and maximum speed output as her previous sisters, and captured the westbound Blue Riband in August of the following year, taking it away from her sister the Pacific. 2 years later, she even bested her own record, bringing the record down to just over a 9.5-day crossing. The Blue Riband was eventually won away from her by Cunard in 1856, the Baltic being the last American ship to hold the Blue Riband until the United States captured it once and for all 100 years later with the SS United States. During the Baltic's career, she had her own little musical piece written for her to be played during voyages. We've actually obtained a copy of that sheet music, arranged a recording on a period piano, and that is what you are listening to in the background, the first known recording of this song. She was modified in 1853, having her aftermost mast removed. But other than that, sailed an uneventful career with the Collins line, sailing until the company folded in 1858 and sailing the very last crossing for the entire company's fleet in February. 2 months later, she, along with her sister the Atlantic, were sold off for a total of $50,000 and sat idle for over a year. Like the Atlantic, she too sailed the coast for 9 months until being laid up once more, and then being leased to the federal government during the American Civil War, serving alongside her sister almost the entire time, being operated by the North Atlantic Steamship Company. The Baltic served for the Union the entire duration of the war. Afterwards, the Baltic inseparably joined the Atlantic when she was bought by the North American Lloyd Line and sailed 2 round-trip voyages with them until the company withdrew her and she was once more laid up alongside the Atlantic. In 1870, the Baltic was finally separated from her sister, the Atlantic, when the Atlantic was sold and broken up. The Baltic was sold to a company in Boston which removed her engines and used her as a sailing vessel. She sailed around a bit, being scrapped 10 years later in 1880. The Adriatic. To make up for the loss of half of his fleet, and using insurance money from the Arctic disaster, the Collins line commissioned a 5th vessel, following roughly the same design, but significantly enlarged. Initially, the vessel was to be called the Antarctic, but was renamed the Adriatic. Just like the Atlantic and the Baltic, the Adriatic also had her own musical piece. It's likely all 5 of these ships did, but these 3 are the ones that we were able to track down. We have also obtained a copy of the sheet music, arranged it on a period piano, put together the first known recording, and that is what you are listening to in the background of this section. As with her predecessors, she was designed by George Steers, but he died before she was completed and construction was delayed. It was delayed further by engine modifications, and then finally she was ready for service in 1857. She was 343 feet long on deck, or nearly 60 feet longer than her predecessors. Her maiden voyage was to be from New York to Liverpool on November 21, 1857, but was delayed 2 days due to a death in the company. This was ultimately her only voyage for the Collins Line, and she was laid up as the company collapsed, then was subsequently bought by the North Atlantic Steamship Company and sailed for a few months between the United States, Britain, and France. She escaped service during the American Civil War as she was sold to the Galway Line for use as a British mail carrier in 1861, a few months before the American Civil War broke out. At some point in 1863, she became stuck in ice and was photographed, becoming one of the very few existing photographs of her or any of the Collins liners. Curiously, she was commemorated in an 1869 stamp, but in 1871 she was gutted and turned into a coal barge for the African steamship line. Here, she was completely neglected and poorly maintained, sometimes functioning as a cargo hulk for steamers to tie up to. In August 1885, she sprung so many leaks that her crew were forced to beach her. Her wreck was picked over so much that she was more or less scrapped on site, but it's very likely that a part of her still remains somewhere under the sand. It should be noted that during the course of the company's operation, the Collins Line chartered at least 4 vessels from outside of its proprietary fleet. The Columbia, built in 1856, was chartered for 2 round-trip voyages. The Erickson, also built in 1856, was chartered for 11 voyages from 1856 to 1857. The Nashville, built in 1853, was chartered for 1 voyage to fill in the gap left behind by the loss of the Arctic. Finally, the Quaker City, built in 1857, was chartered for 1 voyage. Interestingly, the Quaker City seems to have served alongside the Atlantic and Baltic quite often during the Civil War as a transport. The Adriatic, its gutted hulk being picked clean in the African sun, was the last of the Collins Line fleet, an ambitious and advanced company that was limited by its technology and ultimately unsustainable. If you haven't already, be sure to watch this video's companion documentary detailing the history of the Collins Line itself, in which all 5 of these vessels are interwoven. If you've enjoyed this set, I also have a playlist on all of the Collins Line videos. I have a similar series on the White Star Line's history and fleet. Please be sure to subscribe, and thank you very much for taking the time to study the Collins Line with me. A huge thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon for helping cover the cost of these rather large Collins Line documentaries, especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, Erwicka, Zach Starosu, Tom Shavada, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Dakota Charbone, Zolt Bognar, and Nicholas Musella. If you enjoyed this video and want to support my ongoing research into maritime stories and lost history, please consider becoming a patron yourself at the link below.